As an intro, just quickly, I want to spend 20 seconds on the type of game I'm working on. It's a loot-based RPG with deep customization. It's all about crafting, finding loot, building your character with a very fast-paced, auto-attack combat feel. I won't talk too much about the Binding of Isaac roguelite part because it's also the one that's gonna be probably explored at the end. It's not very... The skill system is what will allow the character customization and build and the archetype feel. My idea is that you don't have a predefined class, so you just you start the game with just a regular guy, and based on the skill that you equip, you will go for an archetype, a mage, a melee, a ranger, or a summoner or whatnot. The idea of how skill are gonna work at the moment, what I'm working with is having 5 slots of auto-triggering skills. So the base skill in the first slot is the one that comes from equipping a weapon. It's not something that you can choose beside choosing the weapon that you're using. So for example, at the moment, a bow will give you a shoot arrow skill that trigger every second. The other 4 slots is where you can equip skills, and a concept that I'm playing around with is that the first slot add a little bit of cooldown. It might be 0 at the moment. I'm playing around with 1 second, and the second slot and third and fourth add a little bit more. The idea is that you want to put your primary skill or your stronger scaling skill at the beginning and other skill later. This is something we'll have to play a little bit around. So as I said, skills are items that you drop, and when you get an item, you can just drag and drop into a free slot, and the skill will start to auto trigger every cooldown cycle. At the moment, they are not using mana, but it's something I want to play around because I think there is an interesting play there where you can scale mana cost, and having skills that might trigger too fast for the mana cost, and you need to manage that resource because ideally you want to have enough mana to always be able to cast all the skills that you have. While equipping weapons will change the base skill that you have equipped, and this is the one that will scale off your main weapon. On the configuration side, I just want to show the configuration that I have in this very early prototype because they represent how a skill might function. There is a lot of stuff missing, but at the moment I have implemented beside 2 base skills, the fireball, because I thought that's a kind of an iconic skill to implement, and I wanted to have the implementation of something that is a projectile that you shoot, and when it collides with an enemy, it explodes in a area of effect damage. So at the moment, the configuration of the fireball, there is the damage type, the configuration of the projectile is separate. The projectile is where we can configure the speed of the projectile itself, the damage that the projectile does, and the pierce chance. So it's the probability for the projectile to do damage to an enemy and pass through. In the case of the fireball, it will not. It will do 2 damage to the enemy the projectile collide with, and then it will explode for 5 to 10 damage in a 3 unit radius at the target origin. This is because the skill could trigger on yourself at the moment or on the target. And this is the idea of the visual effect that will be triggered at the location. This is very simple config that just implement what I have now, but beside those 2 points, there will be more and more to explore. But the idea that I want to play with is to have skills that can be crafted or drop with some different affixes. So you can find another skill that is a fireball but has something different. Same with the level. Maybe the level is also something that you have to drop. It doesn't level up with you. But those are just some of the ideas that I will want to explore later on. And just quickly to show, if I add the fireball, I will start shooting a fireball that can collide with enemies. I have my melee weapon that does this attack, and then the bow has an arrow that is faster, and I think the arrow has a 50% chance to pierce. At the moment, there is no collision with walls. It's something that I want to implement. I think the fireball will explode when impacting a wall. How a skill and how a projectile and relative damage is updated. I mean, first of all, I really wanted to decouple any logic with any view update that you see in the game. So all this part of the game loop in the tick is, updating the underlying logic. I think we'll start with kind of the player attack, which it's basically just gonna look at all the skills that you have equipped. And if a timer is ready for a skill, it's gonna create a behavior for that skill and perform the skill. This is where the logic per individual skill is implemented. So the fireball will have its own implementation. Let's see, fireball skill behavior. We just basically create a raleted object containing the area of effect data. It creates the projectile with the config for the projectile and the data associated that's going to be used when the projectile impact the enemy and it will explode. If here I go back after, the player attack creates the projectile, then all the projectiles are updated. For the player, we just go through the projectile in the map. We update kind of the position, rotation, and whatnot. And if a projectile is expired, we create the area of effect attack that's going to be processed later by somebody else. So what this does is basically just checking if a projectile is expired, and when a projectile impacts an enemy, if it doesn't pierce through, it's considered expired, and that's what triggers the explosion. At the moment also, if the lifetime of the projectile expires, the fireball explodes. Well, we'll see if this is something we want to keep. But this will basically create in the map state an object with all the data to perform an area of effect attack. After that, all the enemies are updated. There's something not important at the moment. Then the projectile enemy collision check is checking for all the projectile if they are colliding with an enemy. And it will just create a collision data that's processed later on. When a projectile is colliding, this is the check that will decide if the projectile will still survive the collision or not. This is what will apply then the damage to the enemies. So we'll check all the collision. I'm really trying to separate as much as I can, having one function that does one thing. So updating the projectile, creating the projectiles, creating the kind of out of effect that's going to be applied by something else later, by a function later. This is a function that just check for all the projectiles that have a collision. We apply the damage to the enemy. And then this is what then creates the explosion. So it checks if there are out of effect damages to be detonated. At the moment, that detonation and out of effect can happen with a delay. In the case of the fireball, where the projectile expiry create an out of effect right away, but this is implemented in a way that can support creating something in a point in space and detonate it later. And then for each out of effect damage, this is what plays the visual effect explosion for the fireball. And then we check all the enemy that overlap with, in this case, the 3-unit circle. Thanks for watching, and let me know if there is a particular part of the video that you would like to know more, and in general, if game design or coding is the thing that interests the most. Thanks. Bye.